Do you know that guy?
Greetings and thank you for joining me here on Jed's Moto. This is Jed's, obviously, and you're here in the Jed's compound. And today we're going to be talking about my Triumph Bonneville T120. This is the 100,000 mile talking point review buyer's summary. Basically, I'm going to go through everything that I know that I can really share the information on this Bonneville. This video might be long, so if you need to jump places, talk about, some of the reliability issues or the upgrades I've done or the cost of ownership, I'm going to go over all that today with you on this episode of Jed's Moto. This here is my 2018 Triumph Bonneville T120. I bought this bike brand new on April 27th, 2018. I've owned the bike for 1,265 days or roughly 3.5 years. The amount of miles I put on this bike was like 100,000. That averages out to about 79.8 miles a day I've ridden on this bike. But please note that I only ride this thing 6 to 8 months a year. We've got winter here in Vermont, so I really can't ride as much as I'd like. So I bought this bike brand new. The purchase price was $11,800. It's a standard T120 black, so it's basically the cheapest model I could get into. I really wanted the T120. And I traded in my XR1200 for this specific bike. The reason I decided to go with the Bonneville T120, it all goes back to going down to Daytona year 2018. I met up with my good friend Scott Ald from Amen Moto, or Scotty Amen. He was really gracious enough to let me put some big miles on his T120, and I gotta tell you, I fell in love with that bike. I was running that XR1200 Sportster, not really a big fan of it, then kind of got into this because Scotty's like, here, you gotta try this out, and sure enough, I fell in love. The smoothness, the styling, the power, the handling, and his was all stock and still is. I was like, this is the bike that I want. So I bought my bike, went in, after that Daytona, I drove home and kept the bike on the back of my truck and basically drove it to Pembroke, New Hampshire, where National Power Sports, which was my closest dealer, which was about 150 miles away from my house. I went and picked out a T120. This one, I really just wanted a standard bike. I wasn't really looking for any custom paint jobs because I knew I was gonna put a lot of miles on the bike, so I didn't really want to have to mar it up. And if I wanted to paint it a different color someday, I could. So I just got the basic T120 and traded in my XR1200 for it. And they gave me a pretty good trade-in for the XR1200 and basically rode out with this Bonneville in late April, early May of 2018. So you're probably here going, Jeds, I'm tuning in. What kind of issues have you noticed with this bike? And I really went through basically everything that I could recall I had either paperwork for or things that I know that went wrong. And I wanted to share that with you. And I'm just gonna go through it chronologically, and it's not necessarily date-wise, but by mileage. So the first issue I had at 12,000 miles was the radiator went. It started having a weep around one of the mounting tabs. I remedied it with some JB stick weld and some JB weld, and I got the leak to be a slow drip. So I contacted Triumph and they said, okay, no problem. Just take some pictures of the problem and we'll order you a radiator. So I rode on a bad radiator for about 4,000 miles. It was leaking. I was always adding coolant to the reservoir. So that was the first issue. I looked past it saying, hey, no problem. I'm just gonna keep riding it as is. It might be just a fluke, right? So we'll just keep going. So later that summer at 15,000 miles, I experienced the gear selector shear failure. So that's basically when you can't shift the gear. It just the shifter just goes in circles. So I had that issue. Bike went down in the grass. Shouldn't have caused that kind of issue, but it did. It sheared the gear selector. Luckily for me, I was at a buddy's house, Steve, Special Case Customs. Shout out to you. Steve actually helped me remove gear selector shaft from the motorcycle, which required taking the clutch out and the clutch basket out and taking that whole componentry out. And we re-welded the actual fork shift to the shaft and put it back together. and the bike ran and it shifted fine. And it's actually had that same shifter selector shaft in it since then, and it's been working great. So if you're ever in a pinch and you have the gear shift selector failure, you can actually fix it yourself if you know someone, or can get to a welder and just have them re-weld those tacks. They're very, very, very poor small tack welds that on that whole selection. So we went through and welded them really tight, and now it works fantastic. That was the second failure. About 18,000 miles, I started to notice the bike was running rough, and I inspected the airbox, and something, I don't know if it was an animal or just something happened in the assembly, but the actual intake airbox, like filter assembly, was destroyed. So there was air filter element bits going into the engine. Great, right? So I took it all apart, and at that point upgraded to the pod filters. A lot of folks think I just did this as an upgrade, which is a great upgrade, but there was actually necessity because I was just done with like whatever caused that failure. I just didn't want to deal with it, so I just circumnavigated and put the pod filters on. That happened around 18,000 miles. Then the big one, at 20,000 miles, the transmission completely failed. It was caused by an output shaft bearing issue. So apparently there was an issue with either the output shaft bearing and some kind of metallurgy in the sixth gear. And the combination of the two caused the sixth gear to destruct. So I lost sixth gear. Well, I kind of had it. It was just like a because he would miss gears and gain gears and miss gears because there were gear teeth missing from the transmission. The output shaft itself was actually oscillating inside the transmission. So it could have led to a catastrophic failure, which would have been engine destruction, grenading the guts of the transmission out. But National Power Sports, I called them. They were awesome. They came and picked the motorcycle up, brought it back, repaired the transmission. Also, they performed the 20,000 mile service at that point free of charge. So that was like a $5,500 repair bill that I didn't have to pay one penny for. And I have to say thank you again, National Power Sports and Triumph Motorcycle Company, to backing your product and getting me back on the road. It did take about a month for all the bits to come in, so that was pretty bad in like the timing sense, and it happened right in September, the best riding month. In my opinion, I could really rack a lot of miles because it's cool and it's beautiful, but I lost that month. So I only ended up getting about 20,000 miles that year because of the transmission issue, but Triumph stood behind it. Around 22,000 miles, I started noticing the rear fork shocks were weeping pretty bad. All the seals were blown out. So what I decided to do at 22,000 miles was just redo all the suspension, put in these progressive shocks. I've had these on for 78,000 miles. They've been great. And then I did a preload adjustment on the front forks, kind of get that raised feel. The whole suspension's up by 10 millimeters. And then I also did the Shindy front end fork stabilizer, which was huge because I was noticing I was having oscillation issues, especially powering out of turns. If I were to hit come out with a power wheelie or a slight lift of the front wheel, as soon as it would drop down, you get an oscillation. That fixed that problem. One of those things that it's not necessary unless you're kind of an aggressive sport touring rider like I was, and that's why I put it on. So anyways, the whole suspension was pretty much clapped out at 22,000 miles, so that's something to note. At 33,000 miles, I noticed the stock fuel tank cap failed. I don't know if it was an O-ring issue or something internal, but every time I filled it up, it would cause a siphoning problem, and gas would just spew all over the tank. Kind of a dangerous situation. Can't really ride the bike, especially if you fill it up, so I was kind of just like not filling it up all the way, which stinks because these tanks only have 3.8 gallon tanks, so you lose some range. So I ended up just getting a Harley-Davidson Sportster cap, which fits perfect, and it fixed the problem. Around 39,000 miles, the stock fuel filter completely clogged, and it was causing a really odd running condition where at full throttle, it kind of would just fall on itself. Think about like when you're running lean on a carburetor. It was basically doing the same exact thing. So at 39,000 miles, I brought it into CycleWise. They got me a fuel filter. They figured it out for me. I did have to pay for that filter out of pocket, and it was pretty easy. You just take out your ascending unit inside the bottom of the tank. It's in there, you unhook it, you hook it in, the new one, and this new filter has been great. So I don't know if there was something fouled up with that filter or what, but this new filter is still working great at 100,000. At 45,000 miles, the stock exhaust system was pretty much damaged beyond repair. This was really not the bike's fault, but maybe it has something to do with the design of the bike exhaust. As everyone knows, the new generation T120s have the welded X pipe together. This guy does not. It has the gaskets and everything. So what happened was I was going down the road, going through Ohio, just slabbing. I think I was doing like an 800-mile day. I was stuck in traffic in the middle lane and a tire delaminated on a truck next to me. The tread came off, went underneath the bike, hit the X pipe directly, caused an exhaust leak. And ever since then, I couldn't fix the exhaust. Like, it would always leak, and I'd put it back together, put new gaskets, and about 10,000 miles later, it'd start leaking again because everything was just all locked down on the pipes. So because of all the joints, there's just way too many joints. It's a 2-cylinder bike. You should have really a few joints in the exhaust, not 6 joints in the exhaust or 8 joints in the exhaust. It's absolutely ridiculous. So I had to replace the exhaust at that point. And I went to a Tech 2-1 for the bike, and then I replaced and eventually ended up on the bobber system that's on it now, the Declavic system. 64,000 miles. Both ABS sensors failed. I was having intermittent ABS issues, speedometer issues. You know, the speedometer would drop to 0, come back, then all of a sudden all the Christmas tree lights would go on. I'm like, what the heck's going on? It ended up being that the stock sensors were compromised. The actual plastic part of it was wearing out, so you could see the metal part of the sensor, and water was getting in there and grounding them out or faulting them out. So basically I replaced both sensors at 64,000 miles and it fixed all the problems. So something to think about if you got a high mileage Bonneville and you're starting to notice that the ABS isn't working correctly, or the speedometer isn't working correctly, or it decides to go to 0 and come back on, maybe take a look at your sensor. By 65,000 miles, the Tech 2-1 exhaust totally failed. So I had 20,000 miles on that exhaust. Everything was all broken. Every single joint on that exhaust was being held together by like exhaust repair because the clearances had become so loose that it would just rattle and rattle and rattle. And there was a couple of points where I went over some speed bumps and the exhaust itself would just disconnect and it would just be straight pipe onto the ground, and it just sounded horrible and it ran horrible. Talked to Danielle from DNK Tunes. She said that those systems are totally restrictive and not good for the Bonneville 1200s. They work better for the 900s, but for the 1200, it's just too constrictive and not a good flow. So we got rid of that and we went with the Bobber 2-2. For the last 36,000 miles, I've been running this Bobber exhaust and I have been totally impressed with it. The sound's great, runs awesome, and it doesn't leak. At 82,000 miles, the actual coolant reservoir failed. There was a crack in it. It was leaking coolant all the time. Put more coolant in, it would leak it out. Put more coolant in, leak it out. I'm like, what is going on? Bananas. So I pull it out. Coolant was, the reservoir itself was broken. I don't know if I hit something. It's in a horrible spot. It's right underneath the rear tire here, right underneath the belly pan, right here. It's located. And I guess the rear tire must have kicked something up, damaged it. So I rerouted all the coolant, and now I'm running a coolant system, a post-factory reservoir coolant tank. And this thing works great. So it's been on there for 18,000 miles, no problems. It's aluminum, and it's much easier to check the coolant now instead of like getting on your hands and knees and trying to see through the dirt and grime at that little, and you know, it's a white tank, so you can't even see through the tank. Now you just pop the cap and just take a look. Oh, I'm low on coolant or not. I haven't lost any coolant. I think I was losing coolant because I was always adding coolant, even after the radiator problem. I think it had something to do with that tank just slowly giving out. So something else to think about. And then at 89,000 miles, the rear ABS sensor went again. So I replaced that. Not really the bike's fault, but maybe it's a design flaw. But hey, I'm just reporting it. I picked up a bungee, came up, wrapped around, and that rear side, and it killed the sensor. Like, it broke the actual plastic, so it would like slide in and out, and I just replaced it. To note, With the sensors, you can buy them used, and they're the same as a lot of the Daytonas and the street triples and such. So they all interchange. You can just buy a used sensor for like $20, $30 instead of getting a brand new one from Triumph. It does work. So that's about it for all the issues, but you really add them up, that's 11 issues. I would call them 11 critical issues, as it really affects how the bike runs and really affects if you should ride it like that safely. So I'm going to call those critical issues or critical failures, and there has been 11 documented critical issues with this bike since I've owned it for the last 3 years or 100,000 miles. So let's talk about maintenance and cost of ownership. I'm just going to go through everything that I've done to this bike. Not necessarily essential, but things that I've done, which I recommend you do. It really affects the long-term rideability of the bike, especially if you do something like me, like do a lot of modifications. So let's just go through everything. We'll go through all the costs, and then we'll tell you how the total cost of ownership is. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna recommend, not necessary, but this is what I did. It would cost me about $300 to get into, was doing the ECU tune, getting the ECU tune software on your phone, getting the OBD2 Link MX Bluetooth connector. So you basically connects Bluetooth to your phone, to your bike, so you can pull your engine codes and you can do your maintenance lights. And I also I'm gonna add the tune in, because the tune really changed how the bike ran. It really made the bike run cooler, and it's really kind of been pinnacle in this, like in its later life. I've noticed since I did the tune, the bike actually runs better, and I haven't had any real issues with the engine, transmission, or anything like that. I'm not saying that it's the reason, but it's definitely something to look into. If you're gonna buy this motorcycle, just doing a basic tune, getting out of the stock tune, is just gonna make the bike run happier, run cooler, which is gonna let the bike run longer. So a little more fuel, sure, but it's gonna help with the engine longevity in the long run. Just like, your old oil air-cooled bikes, putting a little extra juice in the middle 2 cylinders, if it's a 4-cylinder, it's just gonna help the bike run longer, better, and be healthier. It might be a little more rich, but it's just gonna help in the long run. So $300 for that, definitely worth doing. I'm adding it to the cost of ownership because I think it's something that you really should do. Okay, so oil changes. Let's talk about that. So this bike had technically 3 oil changes in the first 20,000 miles. One of those oil changes was covered by the 20,000 mile service that was covered for free. So I'm only gonna count the 2 oil changes in the first 20,000 that I paid for. And then after the engine and after the transmission failure, Triumph actually told me, go to 5,000 mile oil changes on this bike. Change the oil filter every 10,000 miles, but do 5,000 mile oil changes. We sell these bikes with the thought that most folks are gonna do less than 10,000 miles, but change their oil annually, which will be like 6,000 miles or so, 6,000 to 8,000 miles. So Triumph told me, switch to 5,000 mile oil changes. So I did. So if you add everything all up, I've done about 16 oil changes in the 80,000 miles afterwards. So that's total of 18 oil changes. I've bought 10 oil filters in the last 100,000 miles. So that means 10 oil filters and about 72 quarts of oil I've run through this motorcycle. So the filters cost me about $175, and the actual cost of the oil was about $635. And I'm running the Castro 1, the recommended oil, every time I do an oil change. So it's the Power 1 full synthetic Castrol 10 weight 40. It's all this bike's ever seen, every 5,000 miles. And I also buy it in bulk. So I buy the cases, so you can buy them in 6 packs. I buy them in actual 12 packs, so there are 2 6-packs. And it gets to about, I think it's like $8 a quart. So all said and done, I've spent $810.40 to do oil changes on this bike. I did swap, as soon as I got the bike, I got rid of those horrible Pirellis and went right to ZR rated radials in the front and the rear. I converted the rims, and then I eventually went to alloys, but I converted my spoke rims to tubeless rims so that I could just run tubeless. I ran either the Michelin Road Pilot 4 GTs or the Road 5s, basically the whole time I've had this bike. I've had a set of powers on this bike. I'm back on the Road 5s, so that's what I ran. So In the course of the time I've owned this motorcycle, I have put 13 rear tires on this bike, and that equates to a cost of around $2,899 in rear tires. And then the front tires, I've done 6, and that's equated to $1,079. So I've totally spent, for all the tires that I put on this bike, roughly $3,978 on all the tires. Chain and sprockets, I've put 5 final drives. I've actually got the 6th final drive in my house ready to go on. And I'm gonna count that into the 100,000 mile ownership costs, just because it needs to be done. This chain, let's do it. It's like rattling. It needs to come off. They average to about 20,000 miles. Some last a little longer, some last a little less. All depends on how you're riding. Notice if I do like 1,000-mile days and I'm not as diligent, or even if I do put oil on, the chain's so hot, it just flings right off, and you can cook a chain real fast, especially if you're going through the South in the summertime and you just burn your chain up. So sometimes they last longer, sometimes they don't last as long. I'm on 5. I've done 5 so far, so I'm gonna say I've done 6. I'm gonna be doing 6 chains and sprockets. So all of those together has cost me $1,100, so $1,164 in cost for chain and sprockets on this bike. Brake pads, they seem to be every 20,000 years. I replace these annually. So sometimes they last a little longer, sometimes they last a little, I just replace them. 20,000 miles or so on the fronts, the rears last 10,000 miles, I need to replace them. I don't go with the semi-metallic. They seem to chew up things, so I just run the cheap pads. About $200. I've replaced 10 rear sets and 5 fronts. So, ends up being $200 in cost for brake pads. Brake rotors, actually replaced the front rotors. These are aftermarket Bandit 1200 floating rotors that are brand new. So I just replaced them. I'm gonna add them in the cost. They were $152. I actually had to replace the rear rotor because it was getting scounged up pretty bad, because I did try some sintered rear pads. So I went back to just the cheap Caltrek, cheap pads, put a new rotor on. So I've spent about $252 in rotors for this bike. Brake fluid, it's a 2-year, regardless of miles. That's what the manual says. So it was like 20 bucks in brake fluid. Did the ECU tune, again, this is where the ECU tune gets clutch. You can, cycle through your ABS pump and filter the fluid out that way, or push the fluid out that way. It's an essential thing, especially if you're working on doing brake fluids on a bike with ABS. So like I said, the ECU tune came in handy there because it allows you to cycle the ABS pump and filter out all that old oil. 20 bucks in fluid. I'm just going to say that because I just bought a big container. Radiator fluid. Truth is, I didn't really spend a lot of money on radiator fluid. You are supposed to replace it every 30,000 miles or so. But every time I got the radiator fluid replaced, it was on the dime of Triumph, because there is either going in for the radiator or the 20,000 mile service. So I'm going to say I have put radiator fluid in when I was leaking, and I'm going to say it probably cost me like 10 bucks because I just used the green stuff. So yeah, cheap, whatever. Still runs good. Add the fuel filter. So I did replace the fuel filter. That was $88 or $84.55. So we'll add that to the list as well. I've replaced spark plugs, 4 sets. They're supposed to be done every 20,000 miles. I've done 4 sets myself, and it was $21.95. At $21.95 a set, it was $87.80. I did add chain lube because I go through a bunch of chain lube in a year, probably 2 cans a year, which is the chain, like the big 15, 17 ounce Maxima chain lubes, chain wax, and that equates to $93.88 in cost. The Uni pod filters and oil. So this was probably a good this is of good value. Like I said, if you're gonna run the pods, you should definitely run a DNK tune because it's gonna just make the bike run better. It's just super cheap. I clean these filters every 10,000 miles when I do the 10,000 mile service. For the filters, it was 44 bucks. You had $50 in oil and cleaner. I've spent probably $94 just to keep the air filter clean and ready to go on this bike. So let's talk about fuel costs, because a motorcycle doesn't go anywhere unless you put gas through it, right? So I would say on average, this motorcycle gets about 52 miles a gallon. Sometimes it gets higher, 55, 60. I've seen up to 63, 64 miles per gallon. I've also seen 48 miles per gallon. So on the average, I would say, and I'm looking at my bank statements, I would say a good average would be 52 miles a gallon for this motorcycle. That's what average fuel economy is. That's 1,923 gallons of fuel this puppy has consumed in the last 100,000 miles. And, you know, based on cheap gas, I also run premium in this motorcycle because of the tune. But we're looking at around, let's say, a $3 average for fuel. So I've spent $5,769 in fuel costs, just gasoline, to keep the bike running for the last 100,000 miles. All right. So let's look at everything. So let's add up everything. So if you add up all the costs of ownership that I've just listed, you're looking at a total cost of ownership, if you include the fuel, is $12,863.63 it costs me to run this bike for 100,000 miles over the last 3.5 years. Without the gas, you just take the gas out, it's only $7,009.63. If you add in the total cost of the motorcycle, what I paid for it, the gas that I paid for, and the repairs, and then also tax, title, registration fees, everything encompassed, this bike has cost me $25,922.64. So if you don't add the gas, it's like almost $19,000. So that's it. It's an expensive motorcycle, but hear me out. I've had the bike for 3.5 years, but I've also put 100,000 miles on it. So is it a really good value? I'm gonna let you decide. Why don't you put a comment below if you think that's a good value or not. But the total cost of ownership for this bike, including the cost, again, was $25,922.64, which is fuel, the cost of the bike, insurance, title, registration, parts, repair, service, everything. So there's that. Is it a good value? I can tell you, I'm never gonna probably buy another new motorcycle again just because of the depreciation of that value. But it is worth noting that that does not include the repair and maintenance or the warranty work, which equates to around $7,700 worth of warranty work that Triumph did for this bike and they also threw in the services. So all those costs roughly equate to $7,700 for the transmission gears, the output shafts, the assemblies, the spark plugs, the fluids, the oil, the filter, the labor that it costs for them to do that work, the radiator, all these things. So for me, I feel like that's an acceptable cost for ownership for 3 years with the amount of miles I have. But then again, I think there's better values out there, but is there that many better values out there? I don't know. On a motorcycle that I absolutely love, probably not. Okay, upgrades, modifications. So we're just gonna go through basically everything and that I could recall in chronological order that I've done to this bike. First up, right away, I replaced the aluminum covers for chrome covers. The reason I went this route is because these don't corrode. I've seen on the forum, I've seen on Facebook groups that these puppies like to get nasty, especially if you ride in the rain and the salt, which I do. So I decided right from the get-go, protect the investment, and just bought the chrome covers. As you can tell, these things look just the way they did when I put them on because it's chrome. And it's real chrome, it's not just a plating. You know, they really did a good job with the chroming here. So it's holding up great. Very happy with the chroming. That was the first thing I did for my upgrade. Chain and sprockets, I've been running basically speed twin gearing or Thruxton gearing on this bike. I found that the stock gearing is a little too tall for Vermont riding, so I changed it over to the Thruxton speed twin gearing. For me, I found that it runs a lot better. I have a lot more fun and it's more interactive when I'm going through the turns or accelerating or decelerating and engine braking. I just like the shorter gears. And it really didn't affect the fuel economy that much. I'm not really on the interstate, guys. There isn't really much for interstates here. The only time I take this puppy on the interstate is when I do my big tours, just to get to places, you know, do 1,000 miles in a day every now and then. But most of the time, my days consist of 100 to 200 miles. I ride daily, and it's all back road, mountain road, twisty, curvy stuff that I'm not going much faster than 60, 65 miles an hour. So that Speed Twin stuff, that was my big upgrade that I gotta say was a really worth going into. I also am running a 520 chain conversion. This is the second 520 chain that I've had on this. I'm putting a third 520 chain on it. And the reason I go with that is just go with the 520. It is lighter. There's less parasitic loss, but it really doesn't seem to matter. Like the 520 lasts just as long as the 525. So that's why I'm running the 520. If it was a significantly shorter lifespan on the chain, I would go back to the 525, but it's not. It's not at all. So I'm just sticking with the 520. Tubeless conversion was the first thing I did, and then I swapped those out. Wow, probably like 40,000 miles or so. Went with the alloys. So this is a street twin, little old 900 street twin rim, and a Bandit 1200 front rim. I had a lot of customization on that. But replacing those spokes with these alloys, I dropped 20.4 pounds of weight, and it's rotating weight. So that's like in a quarter mile, that's equivalent to losing 200 pounds on a quarter mile. It's remarkable. The bike livened right up, and going with a 17-inch front rim, the bike handles like a sport touring rig. It really just feels probably equivalent to what a Speed Twin would feel like. Sure, it's not as light because there's not, you got the steel swing arm, and the front end's not as good, but with the lightweight wheels and the lighter rotors, just night and day difference. So that was the big reason why I did that upgrade, because anybody who knows anything about tuning a motorcycle, the best way to make it feel like it's going faster, and it is faster and quicker, is get rid of that unsprung rotating mass. And I gotta tell you, those stock steel chrome plated spoke rims are just heavy, heavy, heavy. And yes, they may look nice. For me, I'll take function over form. And also, when you do that rim conversion, just running radials, ZR rated radials, performance, like just sport touring tires, the bike just handles like it just handles like it's on rails. This bike actually handles better than my FJ09 does, just because of the suspension, the wheels, and the tires. It just handles phenomenally well. Obviously, I've done a lot of power upgrades, pod filters, bobber 2-to-2 exhaust, DNK tune. With this setup, I should be in the 85 wheel to 90 wheel horsepower mark. The tune is very equivalent to that of a Speed Twin Thruxton. I've got more high end. The rev limit was raised to 7,500 RPM. The bike definitely pulls harder to 7,500 RPM. It pulls deep into redline. I don't know, Danielle. Bravo on the tune. The bike is just ridiculously powerful. 0 to 60, 3.1, 3.2 seconds. With my fat butt on it, just gunning it, going straight. I've done times, and it's about 3.1. It's quick. It is not slow, and it will do 130 plus miles an hour, no problem. It is a quick motorcycle. It is not the fastest thing out there, but boy, oh boy, that torque and that little bit extra horsepower makes the huge difference, especially when you lighten it up. And that's the other part I'm gonna go into. I've done a lot of weight reduction on this bike. Center stand, the lightweight rims, just dropping out things that you don't need, the airbox and extra support. Change the fenders out with the chrome fenders. These actually are lighter than the stock stuff. I've dropped nearly, I would say, 30 pounds. And think about that. This is a light motorcycle when you drop that much weight out. The stock exhaust alone is just incredibly heavy. And the chrome plating, the X-pipe, those mufflers, those brackets, just this, much lighter. Everything's much lighter. So weight reduction was a big upgrade I did and made a huge difference in not just acceleration and stopping, but also in handling. So that's why I really was chase giving it a diet. And obviously the suspension upgrades, progressive springs, preload adjustment in the front, stabilizer. You can really make the stock front end a little better just by adding a little bit of preload by putting custom spacers in like I did. I milled custom spacers for the front, got that preload just where I want it, raised the bike 10 millimeters. That was the point of, the preload in the front, and the eye-to-eye on these rear shocks are actually 10 millimeters longer than stock, and it's a firmer spring, so that bike just sits up higher. You can take turns better. As you can tell, I grind hardware all the time. I'm to the point where I don't grind much of anything. It's either everything's all ground out, or I'm too far over and the bike's at its maximum lean angle. So suspension, that was one of the big upgrades. LED conversion in the front, just because it's just better lighting than that H4. Cruise control, putting the factory electric cruise control was huge. I also have a port for heated gear and the trickle charger. Converted my heated gear to this port. It's pretty easy. Just plug in and you've got heated gear, or you can charge your bike, or put it on the trickle for the winter. Because like I said, this puppy sits for about 2 to 3 months a year just sitting here not doing anything because I can't ride, it's snowing. And the chrome fender conversion, these are custom fenders. That's me, wanting a custom look. Love chrome because I'm weird, but it's really reminiscent of my old Suzuki GS 750 with L that had chrome fenders, and that's what I wanted. And bar end mirrors, thank you Wes. These are awesome. He got me these. I love them. They help with sight. I was the lollipop king for a while, and I was very adamant about keeping those lollipop mirrors on. And then I got bar ends. I'm like, what am I doing? So bar ends, way to go. I don't know the brand of the bar ends, so sorry, I can't tell you. Now that I've gone over the upgrades, the cost, my impressions, the problems, the critical issues, I just want to kind of talk about this Bonneville and just kind of take some talking points. Basically, this bike is my favorite motorcycle I've ever owned. Mainly because it's got a personality like no other. It's quirky, it's really beautiful. One of those bikes that you look at, you want to ride it, you get on it, you can't get off of it because it's so much fun to ride. It really says a lot when I put 100,000 miles on a motorcycle and I still love riding. I've owned a lot of other bikes, about 60. I've owned a lot of Japanese bikes that I've put, 70, 80,000 miles on. And by that time, I'm really getting tired of riding them. This Bonneville, I don't get tired of it. I just love riding it. And now that I have it set up, it's just stripped down. This is how it's gonna be for the rest of the time I own it. I just love looking at it. I just love riding it. It's just fun, it's quick. And who cares it's got a pile of miles on it? It still goes. So it really is my favorite motorcycles of all time. Another great point of this bike is this engine. This 1200 high torque engine is probably one of the best motorcycle engines I've ever had in a motorcycle. It has plenty of torque, it has great engine braking, and the 6-speed transmission is silky smooth. The bike itself is smooth. There is no vibration. It just runs super. It's just a great engine. So much torque. It acts like a V-twin, but it doesn't vibrate like a V-twin. It's just a great bike. It really can do basically everything a little sport bike can do, but it can also do everything a Goldwing can do. I can put the big plexi fairing on. I can put bags on it and go do 3,000, 4,000 miles in a week. Or I can come back and strip it down like this, and I can go chase the corners with the sport bikes and keep right up. So it really just does everything you ask of it. It's just a great standard motorcycle. Fuel economy is pretty good for this bike. I would say for a 1200, I'd say it's pretty exceptional actually. Most liter bikes in its class, I would say even like my FC1 or my Bandit 1200 would get like anywhere from 38 to 42 miles per gallon. This guy gets consistently 52 to 55 miles per gallon. Seen more, a little less than 50 sometimes, but generally 52 to 55. It is exceptionally good on fuel. So do note, the stock suspension, not so great. Stock wheels, not so great. If it was me, if I did it all again, I would do it the same way and just get it set up with alloys right off the bat. I would get tubeless right off the bat and do the suspension right off the bat. But that's me. Some folks like that old bike feel. These upgrades really turn the modern classic into a more modern motorcycle instead of that classic feel that you would get with the 18 huge steamroller wheels. So between 4 of my close friends, 3 of us have come up with the issues that they've all talked about on these bikes. Buddies, Scott Light had to have his whole wiring harness replaced, which is a common issue on this bike. Scotty Amen had the immobilizer problem with his T120, had to get that replaced. I've had the transmission issue. I've had the gear selector issue. I've had the radiator issue. So basically, 3 out of 4 T120s that I know personally, good friends of mine, we've all had issues with these bikes. So it's something to note that there is something to say about these bikes, that if you put enough miles on them, and they're all pretty high mileage bikes, except for Doug's. Doug's is not high mileage, but they're up there about 40,000, 50,000 miles. That's a lot of miles. And we're starting to, you will likely experience something if you own a T120 and put a lot of miles on. So that is something to note, that 75% of the bikes out of all the T120s in our circle have experienced some form of critical failure. So something to really keep an eye on. And in that, it is not the most reliable bike. It is not the best motorcycle I've owned because there's just been too many issues that I've had with this bike. Japanese bikes that I've owned, they just seem to last longer and run better. And yes, they don't have the personality. They don't own that favoritism in my book, but they are better because they never let me down. They never broke down. They never had issues that were critical and weird, quirky issues at that. So we'll see how this goes. I got my new FJ09 that I'm going to be putting probably 100,000 miles on that before I get rid of that. So we'll see what happens. Maybe Yamaha's slipping, but I don't think that's going to be the case. So it's something to note that this bike is not as reliable as those Japanese offerings. And there's no way around that. I have to tell you though, despite its flaws, the company Triumph itself stood behind the product and stood behind me as a rider and kept me on the road, kept my bike going. I can't be more appreciative of that. They've really made me a Triumph enthusiast just because they back the product, and the network, the Triumph network that I'm accustomed with here in the Northeast is exceptional. Big shout out to CycleWise, Triumph Vermont group there, Tamara, Joe, Andy, Steve, Mark. I might be forgetting some others, but they will bend backwards to make sure that my bike is in good shape. They got all the parts that I need, and they're there to support me as a rider and support my motorcycle as a serviceable dealer. The whole experience of becoming a Triumph owner has really wowed me. And this is where I'm going to kind of go to say and ride into, would I do it all again and buy this motorcycle? Most definitely. I would definitely buy a Triumph. Will I buy another Triumph? Probably. Who knows? Maybe I like that FJ09, or maybe I'll trade it in for a Tiger. Who knows? I really love the brand camaraderie. You don't get that with the Japanese brands. There's a great group of individuals. If you're look out for the TOMCC, here in the New England chapter is just amazing. The support is great. The camaraderie is great. And I really feel like I'm a part of a community. I've never felt like that with any other brand per se. There's no snobbery with owning a Triumph because it's a Triumph. We all have problems sometimes, and we all have to address issues sometimes, but we all love riding motorcycles, and the Triumph brand seems to really just deliver that wholesome, awesome, unique experience, and has a great group of folks following it. So that's where I'm at with my Bonneville. So I want to give you a big special thanks to Amen Moto, specifically Doug. I was actually retired this bike this year. I was going to be done with it. It has 80,000 miles. I was just going to putter. Doug sent me a private message and said, hey man, I really want to challenge you to do 100,000 miles on that. So I put all my other bikes away, pulled this back out and put 100,000 on it just so I could say that I did it. And I appreciate the the enthusiasm and the support and the great words, and the Amen Moto group family that we have there is great. So big shout out to you guys. I couldn't have done that without your inspiration and your support. Scott, Amen. I can't thank you enough. This motorcycle is like the best motorcycle I've ever owned, and I just am so appreciative of you just letting me take the time to ride your motorcycle and talk me off the ledge a few times. There's been moments where I'm negative Nancy with this bike, but then again, I can always come back around and love the bike, and we'll always love this bike. So thank you for just bearing with me and talking me off some ledges, but also keeping me encouraged and supporting me through that. Also, Scott, Light, Wes, you guys are also just part of that group. I appreciate you guys, and I always enjoy talking to you and enjoy sharing conversations. All right, folks, I'm gonna wrap this one up. I'm probably pushing close to a long video, and I appreciate you guys sticking through the whole thing and enjoying. I hope you enjoy what you saw today. If you like what you see, make sure you like and subscribe. I will probably not be doing much more Triumph Bonneville T120 content, as the bike is now being moved to retirement, and might do some videos of it doing track days. I've got a couple other videos. I have an upgrade specific video with me riding the bike coming. I've got some other videos that'll come that will have the T120 in it, but specific T120 content will probably be dwindling now as I move on to another bike that I'm going to be riding primarily. But you can always just like and subscribe, follow along. I've got some good adventures. I meet some great people, know some great folks, and I'll have also other motorcycle related content that may not pertain to this specific model, but in motorcycles in general, because we all know that motorcycles are great. It doesn't matter what you drive. It could be the little 250, it could be the big 1700 VMAX. It doesn't matter. Motorcycles are just cool, and it doesn't matter what it is, as long as you ride and you enjoy the ride. So on that note, folks, make sure you keep a shiny side up, and I really appreciate you coming along and then sticking around for this whole video. All right, have a great one. Best.